They moved it all in the middle of the night. Shanghai's silver vaults, once holding millions of ounces, now echo empty. The last shipment left 3 weeks ago. No headlines, no explanations, just gone. While everyone watched cryptocurrency and real estate, the people who understand what's coming next were quietly positioning themselves. The 2026 shock isn't coming, it's already here. The question isn't whether you'll be affected. The question is whether you'll understand what's happening before it's too late to matter. Some patterns only become visible when they're complete. This one just finished. It started with a phone call that should never have happened. A metals trader in London trying to fulfill a routine delivery order. 50,000 ounces of silver, industrial grade, nothing unusual. Except when he contacted Shanghai, the response was silence. Then, 24 hours later, a single message. Inventory unavailable. Unavailable doesn't mean expensive. Unavailable doesn't mean delayed. Unavailable means it's not there. For the past 18 months, while inflation dominated headlines and central banks spoke in careful language about monetary policy, something else was happening. Something quiet. Something systematic. The largest silver storage facilities in Asia weren't just moving metal. They were emptying completely. But here's what makes this different from every other supply shock you've heard about. This wasn't market forces. This wasn't industrial demand exceeding supply. This was coordination. When warehouses empty simultaneously across different time zones, different regulatory systems, different ownership structures, that's not economics. That's orchestration. The Shanghai Futures Exchange stopped reporting certain inventory numbers in late 2025. They called it a routine administrative adjustment. Routine adjustments don't happen to critical commodity data during periods of global financial uncertainty. They happen when someone doesn't want you to see what's missing. 3 weeks ago, the last recorded large-scale silver movement left Shanghai's bonded warehouses. Destination unknown, documentation sealed, the kind of transaction that requires permissions from very specific people, the kind that gets approved in conference rooms where recording devices aren't allowed. You need to understand something about silver that most people miss. It's not just a precious metal. It's an industrial necessity. Solar panels, electronics, medical equipment, defense systems. Every piece of technology that modern civilization depends on requires silver, not gold, not platinum, silver. And now the largest accessible silver inventory in Asia is gone. When something critical disappears without explanation, the explanation isn't missing, it's being hidden. The official silver supply data tells you everything is fine. Global mining production steady, industrial demand predictable, market fundamentals stable. The numbers add up perfectly. Too perfectly. When financial data becomes too clean, too predictable, too stable during periods of global uncertainty, you're not looking at accurate reporting. You're looking at managed information. Real markets don't behave with mathematical precision during chaos. They reflect the chaos. But there's something else in these numbers. Something that only becomes visible when you stop looking at individual data points and start seeing patterns across time. The silver market has been exhibiting what economists call artificial equilibrium. Prices that should respond to supply shocks remain inexplicably stable. Demand fluctuations that should create volatility get absorbed without visible impact. This isn't market efficiency. This is market manipulation on a scale that requires institutional coordination. 3 months ago, industrial silver users began reporting delivery delays that didn't match the official availability data. Electronics manufacturers in Germany, solar panel producers in Texas, medical device companies in Switzerland, different industries, different continents, same problem. Silver shortages that officially didn't exist. And when you contact these companies directly, they'll tell you about the substitutions they've had to make, premium prices they've had to pay, production schedules they've had to adjust. Then they'll ask you not to quote them by name. Industrial companies don't request anonymity about routine supply chain issues. They request anonymity when they understand they're part of something larger. The London Bullion Market Association reported record silver trading volumes in the final quarter of 2025. Record volumes during a period when official inventories were stable and prices were calm. High volume with low volatility suggests one thing. Someone with substantial resources was systematically acquiring positions while keeping market signals suppressed. Here's what the numbers don't show you. Silver's role in renewable energy infrastructure isn't optional. Every solar panel requires approximately 20 grams of silver. Every electric vehicle requires between 25 and 50 grams. The green energy transition that governments worldwide have committed to implementing isn't possible without unprecedented silver consumption. The same governments now, claiming everything is stable, are the ones whose climate commitments depend on a metal that just became exponentially harder to acquire. They never announce themselves. When institutional buyers want to accumulate strategic resources without triggering market responses, they work through intermediaries, shell companies, and complex financial instruments that obscure the true scale of their activities. The silver accumulation pattern of the past 2 years exhibits all the characteristics of coordinated institutional acquisition. But institutional doesn't necessarily mean private. Central banks don't typically hold silver reserves the way they hold gold. It's not part of traditional monetary policy, except when silver becomes critical infrastructure material rather than just a precious metal. When a resource transitions from commodity to strategic necessity, central bank involvement becomes inevitable. The Bank for International Settlements published a research paper in September 2025 titled Monetary Policy Implications of Critical Material Scarcity. It received minimal media coverage. Academic papers from the BIS don't usually make headlines, but this one contained a section discussing hypothetical scenarios requiring unconventional reserve diversification. Hypothetical scenarios are how central banks test policies before implementing them. 3 central banks began increasing their silver holdings in 2024, not through public announcements or official reserve statements, through subsidiary investment vehicles and sovereign wealth fund allocations that don't appear in traditional monetary reporting. The pattern became visible only when you tracked metal movement through multiple international clearing systems. The European Central Bank's investment arm acquired silver mining equity positions worth over $2 billion between January and October 2025. Mining equity, not physical metal. When central banks want exposure to a commodity without affecting spot prices, they buy production capacity rather than existing inventory. China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange increased allocations to alternative strategic materials by 300% in 2025. The classification is broad enough to include silver without specifically mentioning it. When governments create vague categories for strategic purchases, they're preparing for scenarios they don't want to discuss publicly. But the most telling indicator wasn't official activity. It was the behavior of precious metals dealers who suddenly stopped offering certain products. Large quantity silver purchases that were routine 6 months ago became temporarily unavailable or required extended delivery periods. When dealers who have operated for decades start limiting sales of physical silver while gold remains readily available, they're responding to supply constraints they can't publicly acknowledge. The quiet buyers weren't just accumulating, they were cornering. Everyone remembers the housing collapse, the bank failures, the unemployment, the bailouts. What they don't remember is what happened to silver during the months before everything became visible. Because by the time the crisis was acknowledged, the preparation phase was already complete. Between March and September 2008, silver inventories at the London Metals Exchange dropped by 68%, not gradually, systematically. While financial news focused on mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps, industrial silver users were reporting supply constraints that seemed completely disconnected from the broader crisis. But they weren't disconnected. They were part of the same pattern. When financial systems approach critical stress points, certain resources become strategic rather than commercial. Silver's dual nature as both precious metal and industrial necessity makes it uniquely valuable during systemic instability. Someone understood this in 2008. Someone is applying that understanding now, the Federal Reserve. Whose emergency lending facilities provided over $700 billion in liquidity during the 2008 crisis. What they did not publicize was how much of that liquidity went to institutions with significant precious metals exposure. Emergency funding doesn't just save banks, it preserves strategic positions. JP Morgan acquired Bear Stearns in March 2008 for what appeared to be a distressed asset purchase. What emerged years later, through regulatory filings and congressional testimony, was that Bear Stearns controlled silver derivative positions worth over $40 billion. Positions that would have created systemic risk if liquidated during market panic. Those positions weren't liquidated. They were transferred, consolidated, and expanded. By 2010, 5 major financial institutions controlled over 70% of all silver derivative contracts, not through market competition, through crisis consolidation. When systemic breakdown creates consolidation opportunities, the institutions that survive don't just survive. They emerge with unprecedented control over strategic resources. The 2008 pattern is repeating now, different symptoms, same structure. Financial institutions with silver exposure are being quietly supported through central bank liquidity facilities that don't appear in standard monetary policy reporting. Emergency measures that aren't called emergencies because acknowledging them would trigger the very panic they're designed to prevent. What happened to silver in 2008 wasn't collateral damage from financial crisis. It was practice. Shanghai wasn't just a warehouse, it was the signal. When the world's largest silver inventory disappears without triggering price responses, you're not witnessing market failure. You're witnessing market control at a level that transcends normal economic mechanisms. The Shanghai Futures Exchange handled over 40% of global silver trading volume by 2025. Physical settlement, not paper contracts. Real metal moving through real warehouses to real buyers. When that system goes quiet, it's not because demand disappeared, it's because the metal itself was redirected. But redirected where and by whom? The Chinese government maintains strategic commodity reserves through the State Reserves Bureau. Official holdings aren't published for most materials, but trade flows suggest massive accumulation of critical metals throughout 2024 and 2025. Silver imports increased by over 200% during this period, while exports dropped to near zero. Import without export means accumulation. Accumulation on that scale suggests preparation. 3 weeks after Shanghai's last major silver shipment, China announced new regulations requiring government approval for all strategic metal exports. The timing wasn't coincidental. When governments implement export controls after inventory accumulation, they're not responding to market conditions. They're implementing resource strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative committed China to infrastructure development across 68 countries. Infrastructure that requires unprecedented amounts of silver for renewable energy components, communication systems, and transportation networks. When you control both the demand side and the supply side of a critical resource equation, you control more than markets. But China wasn't acting alone. The Shanghai Signal triggered responses from other major economies. The European Union introduced strategic autonomy regulations for critical materials. The United States activated Defense Production Act authorities for semiconductor materials that require silver inputs. Simultaneous regulatory responses suggest coordinated awareness of supply constraints. When multiple governments implement similar policies within weeks of each other, they're not responding to independent analysis, they're responding to shared intelligence. The Shanghai warehouse emptying wasn't the beginning of silver scarcity, it was the end of silver availability for non-strategic buyers. The metal that left Shanghai didn't disappear from the global market. It moved from commercial markets to strategic reserves controlled by institutions that understand what comes next. Industrial users now competing for remaining silver aren't just dealing with higher prices, they're dealing with allocation systems that prioritize strategic necessity over commercial demand. The official projections show global silver demand increasing by 12% annually through 2030. Renewable energy expansion, electric vehicle adoption, 5G infrastructure deployment, all requiring significant silver consumption. The mathematics appear straightforward. Growing demand, stable supply, predictable price increases, except the demand isn't coming from where the projections suggest. Solar panel manufacturers report silver usage has decreased per unit due to technological improvements. Electronics companies have developed silver substitution techniques for most non-critical applications. Medical device producers have reduced silver consumption through alloy innovations. The industrial efficiency gains should be reducing silver demand, not increasing it. But demand continues rising. Someone is acquiring silver for purposes that don't appear in industrial consumption statistics. Military applications require silver specifications that civilian industries can't use. Defense contractors don't report silver consumption through commercial tracking systems. When governments classify certain silver purchases under national security provisions, they disappear from public demand calculations while still affecting physical availability. The United States military increased critical materials procurement funding by 400% in 2025. Critical materials classifications include silver for electronic warfare systems, missile guidance technology, and communication infrastructure. Military silver demand isn't subject to market pricing or civilian allocation systems. Space technology requires silver for applications that have no terrestrial substitutes. Satellite communications, deep space exploration equipment, orbital manufacturing facilities. As space-based economic activity expands, silver consumption for aerospace applications grows exponentially. But aerospace silver demand operates outside traditional commodity markets. China's space program plans to deploy over 13,000 satellites by 2030. Each satellite requires between 2 and 8 ounces of silver for critical components. That's over 100,000 ounces of silver for space applications alone, removed permanently from terrestrial circulation. But the largest unaccounted demand isn't military or aerospace. It's infrastructure hardening. When electrical grids, communication networks, and data centers get upgraded for resilience against electromagnetic pulse events, cyber warfare, or severe weather disruption, they require silver components that weren't part of original industrial specifications. Infrastructure hardening happens through classified government contracts that don't appear in commercial silver demand projections. But the metal consumption is real, substantial, and permanent. The industrial demand that doesn't exist in official statistics is the demand that's driving actual scarcity. They called it monetary policy normalization. Interest rate adjustments to combat inflation, standard central banking responses to economic pressures. Except central banks don't make simultaneous policy changes across different economic conditions unless they're responding to the same underlying threat. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and People's Bank of China implemented silver-related financial regulations within a 6-week period between October and November 2025. Different justifications, different mechanisms, same result. Silver became harder to access through traditional financial channels. Central banks don't coordinate accidentally. When monetary authorities that normally compete for global influence start implementing identical policies, they've identified a shared systemic risk that transcends national interests. The Bank for International Settlements published guidelines for critical material monetary policy frameworks in December 2025, guidelines that didn't exist 6 months earlier. When the central bank of central banks creates new policy categories, they're not responding to theoretical scenarios. They're institutionalizing responses to active threats. But the most revealing indicator wasn't what central banks said, it was what they stopped saying. Quarterly monetary policy reports from major central banks began omitting traditional commodity price discussions, inflation analyses that previously included precious metals. Data suddenly focused exclusively on energy and food costs. When central banks stop discussing a market they've monitored for decades, they haven't lost interest. They've classified the information. The Federal Reserve's emergency liquidity facilities from 2008 were reactivated in September 2025. Not for bank failures or credit crises, for systematic financial stability maintenance. Emergency powers activated before emergencies are acknowledged aren't precautionary. They're anticipatory. JP Morgan received $4.7 billion in Federal Reserve liquidity support between August and December 2025. Not for mortgage exposure or credit losses. For strategic position maintenance. When the largest silver derivative holder in the world needs emergency central bank support, it's not because their positions are failing. It's because their positions are succeeding too well. Central bank digital currencies require silver for the quantum computing systems that enable secure transaction processing. As governments worldwide prepare CBDC implementations, their silver requirements operate outside market mechanisms. Central banks acquiring silver for monetary system infrastructure aren't buying commodities. They're securing operational capacity. The mistake people make about central banks is assuming they react to crises. Central banks create conditions that define what becomes crisis and what remains manageable. When they coordinate silver market interventions, they're not responding to scarcity. They're engineering scarcity parameters that serve strategic objectives. Central banks don't make mistakes. They make choices that look like mistakes to people who don't understand the actual objectives. 2026 wasn't chosen randomly. When you understand silver consumption cycles, infrastructure replacement schedules, and geopolitical transition timelines, 2026 becomes inevitable. The year when multiple critical systems reach capacity limits simultaneously. Solar installations committed through government renewable energy mandates reach peak implementation in 2026. Over 400 gigawatts of new solar capacity globally. Each gigawatt requires approximately 8,000 ounces of silver. That's 3.2 million ounces of silver demand from solar installations alone in a single year for projects already contracted and funded. Electric vehicle production targets set by major automotive manufacturers converge in 2026. General Motors, Ford, Volkswagen, Toyota, and Tesla have committed to producing over 20 million electric vehicles. Each vehicle requires an average of 35 ounces of silver, 700,000 ounces of additional silver demand for transportation alone. Military modernization programs from the United States, China, Russia, and NATO allies reach equipment deployment phases in 2026. Advanced weapon systems, communication networks, and electronic warfare capabilities that require silver components with no available substitutes. Military silver consumption doesn't compete with civilian markets. It supersedes them. But the trigger isn't increased demand. The trigger is the end of available supply buffers. Silver mining production peaked in 2021. Global extraction has declined by 8% since then, while industrial consumption increased by 26%. The gap has been filled by existing inventory that no longer exists. Government strategic reserves maintained buffer stocks of critical materials throughout the past decade. Buffer stocks designed to prevent supply shocks from creating economic disruption. Those buffers were depleted through 2024 and 2025 to maintain price stability while strategic accumulation occurred elsewhere. When buffer stocks are exhausted and production can't meet consumption, scarcity becomes immediate and absolute, not gradual price increases, sudden unavailability. The 2026 event isn't a prediction. It's a timeline convergence that was locked in by policy decisions made between 2022 and 2025, renewable energy commitments that require specific silver quantities by specific dates, military modernization programs that can't be delayed or modified, infrastructure projects that depend on silver-intensive technologies. When multiple irreversible commitments converge with exhausted supply capacity, the result isn't market volatility, it's system breakdown. 2026 represents the moment when silver transitions from commodity to strategic resource, controlled entirely by institutions that understood this transition was inevitable. Industrial users who didn't prepare won't adjust to higher prices. They'll adjust to unavailability. It doesn't end with shortages. Shortages imply temporary scarcity that markets can resolve through price mechanisms and substitution. What happens after the last ounce of available silver is consumed is system reorganization around permanent scarcity of a material that modern technology cannot function without. Solar panel manufacturing doesn't slow down when silver becomes unavailable. It stops completely. Alternative conductive materials exist, but they require entirely different manufacturing processes, different equipment, different supply chains. Converting solar production to silver substitutes takes 2 to 3 years minimum. During that period, renewable energy expansion halts. Electric vehicle production doesn't adapt to silver scarcity through gradual efficiency improvements. Critical silver components in electric vehicles have no functional substitutes. Battery management systems, regenerative braking, power distribution networks. When silver becomes unavailable, electric vehicle production lines shut down until alternative technologies are developed and tested. But the most critical impact isn't industrial, it's financial. Silver derivative markets represent over $2 trillion in contract value globally. Derivatives based on physical settlement of a material that no longer exists in sufficient quantities. When settlement becomes impossible, the contracts don't adjust, they default, systematically. Financial institutions holding large silver derivative positions face simultaneous settlement demands they cannot fulfill, not because of price movements, because of physical unavailability. When derivatives markets collapse due to inability to settle rather than price volatility, the systemic impact affects institutions that had no direct silver exposure. Central banks respond to derivative settlement crises through emergency liquidity provision. But emergency liquidity can't create physical silver that doesn't exist. When central bank intervention fails to resolve market breakdown, the failure becomes monetary rather than just commercial. Governments implement resource allocation systems for critical materials, not price controls, distribution controls. Silver usage gets prioritized by strategic importance rather than purchasing power. Military applications first, infrastructure maintenance second, new industrial production last. When resource allocation replaces market distribution, economic relationships change fundamentally. Companies don't compete through efficiency and innovation. They compete through strategic importance and government relationships. The technological civilization that developed around abundant silver doesn't adapt to silver scarcity. It reorganizes around controlled distribution of silver alternatives that require different infrastructure, different skill sets, different international relationships. After the last ounce, the question isn't how much silver costs. The question is whether your applications qualify for allocation from strategic reserves controlled by institutions that decide which technologies continue functioning. The music doesn't stop suddenly, it fades. First the supply chains that seemed reliable, then the price mechanisms that seemed predictable. Finally, the institutional responses that seemed adequate. When something critical to civilization becomes unavailable, the adjustment isn't economic, it's civilizational. Industrial production dependent on silver inputs doesn't scale down gradually. It reorganizes around whatever silver remains accessible through strategic allocation systems. Companies that assumed market access discover that strategic importance determines operational capacity. Market relationships become secondary to governmental relationships. The renewable energy transition that governments committed to implementing doesn't slow down when silver becomes unavailable. It stops while alternative technologies get developed, tested, and deployed. Infrastructure projects requiring silver components get suspended indefinitely. Climate commitments made through international agreements become impossible to fulfill through existing technological pathways. But the deepest transformation isn't industrial or environmental, it's informational. When critical resource scarcity becomes undeniable, information about resource availability becomes strategically sensitive. Market data that was previously public becomes classified. Supply chain information that was commercially available becomes restricted. The transparency that market systems depend on disappears when transparency threatens strategic positioning. Financial markets don't adapt to information scarcity through improved price discovery mechanisms. They adapt through increased reliance on institutional guidance from entities that control both information and physical resources. Market signals become less important than institutional signals. Central bank communications change from economic guidance to resource guidance. Monetary policy statements include strategic material assessments. Interest rate decisions consider critical resource availability rather than just inflation and employment data. When central banks become resource allocation coordinators, monetary policy becomes resource policy. International trade relationships reorganize around resource access rather than comparative economic advantage. Countries with silver production capacity negotiate agreements that prioritize resource security over commercial optimization. Trade becomes strategic rather than economic. The technological ecosystem that developed around abundant silver availability doesn't gradually adapt to silver constraints. It bifurcates into essential applications that receive strategic allocation and non-essential applications that get discontinued. Innovation redirects from advancement to substitution. When the music stops, the silence isn't temporary. It's the new environment. Systems that seemed permanent reorganize around new scarcity parameters. Relationships that seemed market-based become resource-based. The transition from abundance to allocation doesn't reverse itself. What remains isn't broken systems waiting for repair. It's different systems operating under different rules. The patterns were always visible to those who understood what to observe. Silver disappearing from warehouses while official data remained stable. Central banks implementing identical policies across different economic systems. Industrial demand increasing for applications that didn't exist in commercial statistics. Strategic accumulation occurring simultaneously with public reassurance about market stability. The Shanghai signal marked the end of the transition period, not the beginning of the crisis. By the time inventories became unavailable, the positioning phase was complete. Resource allocation systems were prepared, strategic relationships were established, alternative supply chains were secured. 2026 represents convergence, not breakdown, the moment when temporary scarcity becomes permanent reorganization, when market mechanisms transition to allocation mechanisms, when strategic importance supersedes commercial importance, when information control becomes as critical as resource control. The institutions that understood this transition positioned themselves accordingly. The institutions that didn't became dependent on those who did. The individuals who recognized the pattern adjusted their expectations and relationships. The individuals who didn't continued operating under assumptions that no longer applied. What emerges isn't failure of existing systems. It's successful implementation of different systems designed around scarcity parameters rather than abundance assumptions. Systems that function efficiently within constraints that make previous systems obsolete. The transition completes silently. Resource allocation replaces market distribution. Strategic relationships replace commercial relationships. Information control supplements resource control. Efficiency gets redefined around different optimization parameters. Those who understand the new parameters adapt their strategies and expectations. Those who don't continue expecting previous patterns to resume. The expectation itself becomes the primary distinguishing factor between adaptation and displacement. The music has stopped. What you hear now isn't silence.